Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Shockwave, which are episodes 25 of Season 1 and Episode 1 of Season 2 of Star Trek Enterprise. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as requested by my viewers. This episode was requested by Steve O. So Shockwave is the episode that begins with Archer, T'Pol, Trip, and Reed going on a shuttle trip to visit an alien mining colony who has strict protocols when approaching their colony, as the atmosphere is volatile due to their mining. Although Reed insists that he followed the protocol to the letter, the atmosphere is ignited and the colony explodes, killing over 68 people. The crew investigate what went wrong, as all the evidence is showing that they did nothing wrong, but the explosion itself suggests otherwise. As Archer slips into a hole of self-pity, the Enterprise's mission is called off by Starfleet, and they are ordered to Earth to be decommissioned after dropping T'Pol and Phlox off at a Vulcan ship. So Archer sets a course for the Vulcan ship. However, in the middle of the night, he wakes up to find himself 10 months in the past. There, crewman Daniels, a known time traveler whom they thought was dead, appears to inform Archer that the accident was not their fault and they were never meant to be decommissioned in history, and the whole thing had never been shown to occur. So it was the result of someone tampering with the timeline. So Daniels provides Archer with all the information he needs to retrieve the discs that prove their innocence from the Suliban and returns him to his timeline. With this new information, Enterprise goes on an attack and expertly infiltrates the Suliban vessel and retrieves the disc that proves their innocence. However, on their way to rendezvous with the Vulcan ship, the Enterprise is overwhelmed by a fleet of Suliban ships that have surrounded them and demand that they surrender Archer. Archer agrees that they have no choice, so he decides to surrender himself to the Suliban. However, on his way, Daniel transports Archer to the future. However, when Archer arrives, he finds a future in ruin, and Daniels explains bringing Archer to the future is what changed history to turn Earth into a wasteland. Meanwhile, the Enterprise crew have no idea what happened to Archer, but the Suliban don't believe them, so they capture and torture some of the Enterprise's crew and in order to find out what happened to Archer. The Suliban discover a temporal signature in the turbolift, so believe that Archer was indeed taken to the future. Meanwhile, Archer is seemingly trapped in the future with no way to return to his time, but Daniels uses his communicator to allow Archer to communicate with the past. There, they concoct a plan where the senior staff escape from the quarters where they are being held. Reed retrieves Daniels' database from his quarters and purposely gets caught by the Suliban so that Silik will attempt to use it to communicate with his benefactor from the future. However, when he does this, this allows Archer to use this device to travel back to his time, where he takes Silik hostage and uses him to expedite his return to Enterprise. Meanwhile, Trip, T'Pol, and the others take engineering and set off what appears to be a core breach to get the Suliban to evacuate the ship, and once they're gone, they retake Enterprise, which comes under attack. However, Archer uses Silik to get the Suliban to call off their attack. And the Enterprise contacts Earth, where Ambassador Saval still wants to cancel their mission despite the evidence that the accident wasn't their fault. However, T'Pol makes a rousing speech urging Starfleet not to cancel their mission, and so they don't, and the mission continues. So I've been very outspoken about my dislike of the first two seasons of Enterprise. However, I'd say this two-parter is one of the few exceptions during these two absolutely horrible seasons that actually works. I'd say part one is by far the best episode of season one, as the majority of the episodes that season outright sucked, and a few of them were okay, and perhaps some were slightly above average. I would say that this is the only one that was outright great. The second part, however, has with almost all Star Trek two-parters stretched out over the end of one season and the start of another, is a bit of a letdown and wasn't quite as good as the first part. But again, compared to all of the crap that was in season 2, it does stand out as one of the better episodes that season. So that first part was absolutely great, as it was the first time on the show I felt like there were some real stakes, having their whole mission threatened to be canceled, and the first mission of exploration is the whole point of the show. Plus, seeing Archer go into a depression after learning the mission was canceled was a great character development for him and fit right into the rest of the show. But more than that, it was absolutely awesome to see Enterprise expertly just kick the Suliban's asses and pull off a perfect raid. All season long, the Suliban were continually having one up on the Enterprise and no more than they do, and Silik comes off as all arrogant and cocky, so it was so great to finally see the Enterprise have the advantage and just go in there and kick their asses. Of course, this was kind of undercut by the ending where the Enterprise gets cornered by the Suliban, but it was still awesome. It was also a great moment when Archer first discovers that they were not responsible for the destruction of the colony, and that they were framed, as we saw Archer at his lowest when he felt he royally screwed up. But as soon as he learned that he was framed, he gathered his senior officers together and just meted out a clear-cut plan to attack the Suliban and prove their innocence. It was so awesome to see how motivated and fired up he was, especially when Archer turns to Trip and says it wasn't us. That was a great moment. It was one of the few times in the first season that Archer actually seemed like a great captain and not just an incompetent, bumbling idiot. And it was an amazing cliffhanger, maybe one of the best end-of-season cliffhangers Trek has ever done, having Archer being trapped in a future that's completely destroyed with the Suliban are about to destroy Enterprise. It's one of the bleakest and most hopeless endings of any Trek's season. However, the conclusion to this wasn't nearly as interesting, as they put Archer in too hopeless of a situation that kind of undermined the second part, as the way he got out of it by contacting the past was highly improbable, and especially how he used Silik's communicator, communicating with the mystery man to come back to his timeline. It seemed highly improbable. How would he even know how to use that thing, and how was it able to bring someone back in time, as the mystery man only used it to communicate? And for that matter, how would he know that Silik was so desperate to communicate with the mystery man, as he seemed to use that against him in order to ensure that he tried to use Daniel's database to connect to the mystery man, which is how he managed to come back in time. So the whole thing seems highly improbable. That being said, the second part was still an exciting episode, definitely better than most second season episodes, as we see the Enterprise crew in an impossible situation have to work together to escape capture and scare the Suliban off the ship. That was awesome, even if Archer's role in this was a tad bit too convenient. Also, I liked how T'Pol was being all obtuse about time travel. It kind of fit into her character and the stubbornness and arrogance of Vulcans, as after the events of this episode it was made crystal clear time travel exists, and she still insists that it's impossible because of Vulcan Science Directorate's conclusions. So it's great that how at the end of this episode T'Pol just randomly calls out, "Oh, I still don't believe in time travel," and Archer's very clever response was, "The hell you don't." Archer knows what's up. But it wasn't until T'Pol actually travels back in time herself in the third season episode Carpenter Street that she finally admits that time travel is possible. And this episode also marks one of the few times where Archer's cursing actually works. As every time in the past he uses cursing, it sounds like when your dad swears or tries to be cool. It comes off as corny and out of place. However, the moment at the end where Silik is trying to communicate with the mystery man and he says something and Silik pleads with him to repeat himself as he doesn't understand, and then Archer comes through, kicks Silik's ass and says, "I said you're an ugly bastard." That was an awesome line. Even though I know it wasn't actually swearing here, but it's one of the few times Archer uses harsh language that actually sounds badass and not dorky. But it's also interesting to look at this alternate future that Archer was stuck in, as Earth appeared to be destroyed and the Federation never existed. And the fact that Archer saw a book about the Romulan Star Empire leads me to believe that the Romulans destroyed Earth because the Federation was never formed. In fact, one could say that this was followed up in the fourth season trilogy of episodes, Babel 1, Unity, and the Aranar, where Archer first gets the Andorians, Vulcans, and Tellarites to work together when the Romulans were trying to drive them apart. So it seems that without Archer around, the Romulans were successful in driving those forces apart and conquering the galaxy. So now, let's get into these episodes' negatives, starting with how in the first part, the Enterprise shuttle pod causes an entire colony of aliens to explode. Later, Daniels reveals that it wasn't them, but the result of tampering with the timeline. So he gives Archer the information he will need in order to keep the Enterprise's mission going, because it was never meant to be cancelled. Okay, but what about the colonists? They apparently were never meant to die, and yet Daniels doesn't seem to give two shits about them. I mean, you think the loss of that many people who weren't supposed to die would have a drastic effect on history. I mean, each of them would have offsprings, and they would have their offsprings. Are you telling me that none of these ancestors, none of these descendants would have any effect on history? But just because Archer isn't there for 1 second, it destroys the entire future. Come on. Which leads me to my next complaint. The fact of having Archer temporarily visit the future causes an alternate timeline where the future is destroyed, because the implication was Archer was never there. But the problem is time travel was never established to be work like this on Star Trek, as when someone temporarily visits the future, it's not assumed he was never there in the past, and the future isn't changed because of that. An example is the third season episode where Daniels brings Archer into the future to see a battle where there are Xindi serving on Starfleet, and this battle shows how Starfleet defeated the Spear Builders. However, this future wasn't altered by Archer's absence, and indeed this possible future had already seemed to be altered in the Archer's timeline by the Xindi attack on Earth, which was never meant to happen. So time travel in that episode was completely contradictory to time travel in this episode, but seems more in line with what has been established in all of Star Trek, whereas this episode, it just seemed to make up its own rules. Also, the ending where Saval and the other Vulcans still wanted to decommission Enterprise, despite the fact that they were proven innocent, was ridiculous and really totally fake stakes. Because they had no fucking leg to stand on. Because even though Saval brought up the other incidents, those other incidents weren't enough to cancel their mission. Their whole case of canceling the mission hinged on the destruction of the colony, and with that being proven to not be their fault, they didn't have a leg to stand on. Plus, I never bought how big of an asshole Saval comes off in these earlier seasons. It's very non-Vulcan-like. He's obviously has a grudge against humanity, he just comes off as a prick, not someone who's emotionless. So yeah, the whole ending was totally unnecessary, and I didn't buy it. But of course, the biggest issue I have in this whole thing is the whole temporal Cold War storyline. I still insist that this was the only good thing about the first two seasons, as it produced episodes like these ones, which were some of the very few actually good episodes in the first two seasons. But the way they had obviously had no idea what they were doing with the temporal Cold War and left so many things unresolved was worse than Lost, in my opinion, and most certainly a lot more sloppily done. That's just to touch on what I mean here. Here's a list of questions raised that were never answered in the series. Why did the Mystery Man want to cancel Enterprise mission? And when that failed, why did he want Archer? In the future, Daniel's reason taking Archer is what changed the future, and in this future, the Mystery Man didn't exist. So that would obviously be bad for him. So obviously he didn't have plans to simply take Archer away. So what were his plans? Why did the Mystery Man simply give up after Enterprise proved their innocence, especially if they were still on the thin rope with Starfleet? It seems like another incident is all he needed in order to cancel their mission, so if that's what he really wanted, why didn't he do that? And of course, the biggest question of all is, who is the Mystery Man? When I was watching the commentary for the premiere episode Broken Bow, the showrunners Rick Berman and Brenna Breger couldn't even remember if they revealed who the mystery man was, and they did reveal that they had no idea who he was and just added him to look cool. I'm sorry, but that is absolutely unacceptable and the mark of horrible, amateurish, really bad writing. I mean, these are bad writers. Sorry, but that's unforgivable. As for the other questions, the answer is inevitably because it was convenient for the plot, which is also the sign of bad writing. So, my rating for Shockwave out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. This was definitely one of the high points of the first 2 seasons, but that's not saying a whole lot, saying how bad they were. The first part was pulled off really nicely by showing the crew how they would react to their mission being canceled, and then seeing them kick ass to clear their good names. And the second part was kind of sloppily written, so not as satisfying, but still a high tension storytelling. Both parts weren't without their flaws, though. So that's it for my review of Shockwave. If there's an episode from any of the 5 Star Trek series that you'd like me to review, just leave a comment below with the episode you'd like me to review and I'll endeavor to do so. But please, 1 episode request per person. Also be advised it will be at least a month before I can get to any new reviews. And be sure to check out my channel for many more Star Trek videos, including many more videos on other shows such as Game of Thrones and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.